let's just, yeah, looking at what is a fully modular synthesizer. A fully modular synth is something, so I talked about how synthesizers essentially are made up of a collection of components that are performing their own kind of little function. So in a fully modular synth, all of these components kind of come as a separate item or unit. And they come, you have to basically connect all those yourself in order to get any sound. So here, a classic example of an early fully modular analog synth is this Moog 3C from the late 60s. You can see that basically all these different panels represent different components. And you can see that there's kind of these input and output jacks on the front panels, and that is where you would take what's called a patch cable to essentially connect all of those components, or whichever ones that you want to use. And so you are pretty much determining the signal path in a fully modular synth. So, don't turn it on and get any sound right away. You have to connect all of the components together yourself in order to get sound. Then we have an all-in-one synth, which, famous example also being the Mini Moog Model D, classic mono synth, probably one of the most famous ones out there historically. And an all-in-one synth is something that basically all those components are kind of already come as a single unit. They're housed together, and there's a normal signal path, which basically means that there's like a default way that all of those components are connected so that when you turn it on, you can immediately get sound out of it. And you can also see, so these components on the front panel, there is no, unlike the Moog 3C and the modular synth that we just saw, there's no kind of input or output jacks on the front panels so you can't alter the signal path itself. So, an all-in-one synth is great if you, might be good to start out with one to kind of start to familiarize yourself with the components. Modular synths definitely take a little bit of knowledge first in order to kind of know how to properly connect them. And then we have semi-modular synths, which is basically a hybrid of fully modular and all-in-one synth. And so in a semi-modular synth like the Moog Mother 32, and this is the synth I'll be using in the demo, all of the components like all-in-one synth come housed in the same kind of unit. There's a normal default signal path, so they're already kind of pre-connected for you. But you can see here on the right-hand side, there's kind of this patching matrix on the right, which basically, it gives you access points to all those components, like the ins and outs of those components and their parameters. So you can actually also alter the signal path to kind of quote-unquote get under the hood and basically change signal routing. And that basically kind of exponentially adds to the amount of kind of power you have to kind of control the sound. Just would say, so yeah, I'm gonna just kind of pause here and see if there's any questions. I haven't been looking at the chat. So just about anything that we've talked about so far, modular versus all-in-one. I don't know, Layla, if you...
Yeah, we just got a question from Rachel who was asking, would you say modular synths are for more experienced audio professionals?
Yeah, so I would say, so while modular synths, I think, are actually a really great way of learning like how a synth works, because it's like up to you to really make the sound and understand how to connect everything. But that said, yeah, typically, I think, you are going to have a little bit of an understanding of how synthesis works and, how to connect those components. And hopefully maybe after today, you might have a little bit better idea of how, like, kind of the ins and outs of how to kind of connect all those components are connected. But yeah, you could think that it might be a little bit more advanced, but that said, it is a great way to learn because you're really just given the kind of bare bones and have to kind of do something with them yourself.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks, Rachel, for asking that question. And it looks like we have time for just about one more. And Joanne is asking, what are the differences between digital and analog synths?
Oh, yeah. So essentially, digital is something that uses like a little kind of, it has like a little brain. It's like, digital synth could be a piece of hardware. It doesn't necessarily have to exist in a computer. And actually, the next thing I'm going to talk about are some software synths. But basically, it just means that there's some sort of kind of like computer logic going on that's controlling the synth, and it's not just all analog circuitry. It's not just all basically a bunch of circuits with, kind of these really basic components that are kind of making it work. Um, but yeah, with that, I actually maybe should jump into talking about some software synths really quickly. I'm gonna not spend too much time on this for the sake of time, but I obviously, all the examples that we just saw are hardware synths, and so software synthesizers or soft synths, as they're sometimes referred to, can also be fully modular, semi-modular, or all-in-one. They can often be a good way to learn basics without having to drop a lot of money on an expensive hardware synthesizer. But that said, there are definitely expensive software synths out there and cheap hardware synths. But yeah, there's so many, software options out there, many free, and those could exist as either like a plugin that you download for your DAW or a standalone desktop app. There's different web application like synthesizers that just exist as a web application that you access through a web browser, and also, of course, many different smartphone apps out there. So a couple examples I just wanted to pull up of some software synths you might want to check out. Vcv Rack is a virtual, fully modular synth. Basically, it's an emulation of a hardware synthesizer format called Eurorack, which is pretty much the most popular type format of modular synth out there right today. And so VCV Rack basically kind of has virtual emulations of real world, real life Eurorack modules, and it's free. It's a great, if you are interested in getting into modular synths, it's a really great way to learn without having to buy a bunch of modules, because one single Eurorack module could cost $100 to $200 or even up to like $500. So you can imagine how pricey that gets very quickly if you have to have at least several modules in order to really be making any sound. So VCV Rack is great. I will say it's like a pretty big CPU hog on your computer, so just be aware of that and prepare for your computer fan to start going crazy. Arturia has their kind of V collection. It's like a collection of basically emulations of a bunch of really classic synthesizers from throughout history and keyboard instruments. It is pricey, but it is definitely less expensive than going out and sourcing a vintage, Mini Moog or ARP 2600. So you kind of get a bunch of really classic synthesizers from history just in kind of one software pack. And then, of course, many DAWs come with their own software synths built in. So, Ableton Live Suite has their this analog instrument, which is basically their version of a subtractive synth. They also have an instrument called Operator, which is like an FM synth. Logic Pro has their Alchemy synth built in. So often, like if you buy a DAW, you already have a synthesizer. And then there's a couple links here, and maybe Layla or Christina can pop them in the chat, but there's also as I mentioned, web applications that are out there that you just access through a browser. So this first link it's basically kind of collects a bunch of different synths that are out there that exist as web apps. Some, I've noticed seem to crash pretty easily, but it's a great resource if you want to just kind of go through and see what pops out to you and try things. The second link is a really, really great resource on Ableton's site. It actually is its own, essentially, web application of a synthesizer that you can play, even with connecting a MIDI controller or with your computer keyboard. But it's also a tutorial series that walks you through all of these different, basically just to familiarize yourself with all the things I'm going to be talking about today. So I encourage people actually to kind of check out this link, this Ableton link, if you want to, after today, if you want to freshen up what we talked about, it's a really great resource and I think very intuitive to use. I don't know if there's more questions at this point before we kind of just dive into the basic parts of a synth.
Yeah, we have one that we can quickly jump into. It's, I believe, Aline is the name. Where do you recommend buying a modular synth? I was able to test the Make Noise Golden system, and it's great. and how to choose between all brands, Moog, Make Noise, etc. Because Adria, I know you're very much a Moog loyalist.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I love all synthesizers. I mean, I happen to have the Mother 32, but there's so many out there. So wait, the question is where to buy them, or
Yeah, where to buy and how to choose between all the different brands that are out there.
okay. So one, just quickly, there's many places you can buy them online. Different like Perfect Circuit is in Burbank. If you're ever, I don't know, for people in LA, Perfect Circuit is a really great resource because you can actually just go in and they have tons of racks of modular synths and just other hardware all in one synths out, and they have tables laid out where you can test them all out. But if you don't have that, other cities might have their own resources. Probably can't list them all right now, but Perfect Circuit is also just like an online synthesizer retailer. Modular Grid is another great resource because if you're looking for a specific type of component of module, like I'm looking for a filter module, you can just kind of filter your search results by looking for filters, and then it'll pull up a bunch of different modules that are by different manufacturers of like filter modules out there. So Modular Grid, I would say, is a great resource. You can also kind of mock up your own kind of modular rack with it and see, how much power you'll need. It's yeah, a great resource. So Modular Grid, Perfect Circuit is another good resource. Control in Brooklyn is another online, and also a brick and mortar store. There's yeah, so many other reverb.com, that they also sell Sweetwater, all your typical music retail places. Generally a lot of them now carry modular synths as well. Not sure if that answered all of the questions, but anything else before moving on?
We have one. How do you this is from Badisha? How do you see the differences between Eurorack and the old DIY or other synthesizers?
So the different, specifically, I guess about modular synths, Eurorack is really it's a format of modular synth, and by format, that refers to a couple different things, like the size. So it's like how tall is each module. Eurorack modulars are what you call 3 rack units high. Other formats are different sizes, but format also affects the voltage output that each of these components is putting out. So different modular synth formats work on different voltage scales. They use different types of patch cables. Some use, 1/4-inch cables. Some use 1/8-inch cables. So that's really, and I think, the only other difference I would make is that Eurorack now, because it's exploded in popularity, there's just so many more like modules and interesting things that people are doing. So you probably have way more variety of kind of sound processing you can do with Eurorack modules, and just because of the massive amount of modules that are being produced now. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Were you going to say
Oh
something?
no, yeah, I was just gonna say, I think that's great. I think we should probably move on. But Samantha, you asked a fantastic question that we will definitely be answering in the next block. So don't worry about it.
Okay, cool. So yeah, we'll just dive right into basic parts of a synth. So obviously all synths are different, but pretty much they all contain, I would say, these kind of fundamental components. And so again, yeah, synths made up of different components, and now we're gonna kind of look at what exactly those are. So you can pretty much kind of categorize them into what I would say is a sound source. So something that generates sound, a sound modifier, which affects sound, and a controller, which is something that you use to kind of interface with and program sounds. So before looking at the Mother 32 itself, I just wanted to kind of pull up just like a diagram of it, and this is the faceplate of the Mother 32, and then as well as the kind of normal signal path of the Mother 32. And while we're looking at the Mother 32, I'll just say that this is pretty much a very typical example of the signal flow of a subtractive synth. Subtractive synthesis just to kind of define what that is really quickly, the basic concept in subtractive synthesis is that you start with a harmonically rich sound source. So something that has a lot of partials, a lot of harmonics. You know, all sounds are basically made up of many different frequencies, unless you're a sine wave, which is just one frequency. But all other sounds in this world and electronic sounds basically contain a bunch of different frequencies that give it its kind of really timbral fingerprint, its kind of characteristic sound. So in subtractive synthesis, you start with a sound, a waveform that has a lot of harmonics, that's very rich in harmonics, and then you use a filter to filter out or subtract frequencies from that sound source. So that's where the name subtractive synthesis comes from. Basically, you're just subtracting frequencies from a very harmonically rich sound source. So the typical kind of signal flow in a subtractive synth is basically you have your sound sources, and so let me just point out where those are. On the Mother 32, we have what's called an oscillator, which is something, basically that's what makes sound. It's, in more technical terms, it's really just like a circuit that is generating a periodic or repeating waveform, and a noise generator, which basically is kind of just putting out white noise. Noise has a lot of applications actually in synthesizers, which I probably can't get into today, but it's a very valuable sound source to have on a synth. So those are our sound sources that you can see at the beginning of our signal flow. And then we move into our sound modifiers. So these are the things that are going to affect those original sounds. And that is our filter. And I'm going to go through what all these things are on the synth itself, but just kind of walking through these for the time being. So we have our filter, which is altering our original sound. Then that goes into an amplifier, which is essentially going to be, in this case, a volume control. So that's kind of really just the general signal flow. The other modifiers that we have are what's called an envelope generator and an LFO, which stands for low frequency oscillator. Basically an oscillator that generates a very low frequency, optimized to put out low frequencies. And so those are things that we use to kind of modulate these other parameters. And so you can actually see them in the signal flow diagram, where they have arrows pointing to kind of different components, and which means that these are things that we can use to modulate other components. And then finally, yeah, we have a keyboard and sequencer section. This is kind of the keyboard of the Mother 32, has a built-in kind of mini keyboard. And the keyboard and sequencer are things that obviously we use to kind of play the instrument, play the sounds, or program them, as in the case of a sequencer, in which you're basically programming in a sequence of notes or like a melody. Okay, so I'm going to actually stop sharing. Well, first, let's see, change my camera. Hopefully this works. And then stop sharing, and we're going to look at the Mother 32. Okay. Hopefully people are able to see this. Let me know if there's any issues with the view. Sorry, the lighting isn't great in here, but doing my best. So again, yeah, so we have our sound source section. And again, so our noise and our oscillator, and those basically go through this little mixer, which allows us to choose which sound source we're listening to. So we could listen to noise, or listen to the oscillator. So again, an oscillator is just something that's producing this repeating waveform. There's four kind of general basic electronic waveforms out there that you'll find in a synthesizer: sine waves, triangle waves, sawtooth waves, and pulse waves, and square waves too, but square wave is a type of pulse wave. So the Mother 32 has two different waveforms that you can choose from: a pulse wave and a sawtooth wave. And the reason it uses both of those two is because those two waveforms are the ones that have the most amount of harmonics present in them of all those different waveforms I just mentioned. So again, like a sine wave is just a single frequency, And whereas a pulse wave or like a square wave basically has all odd harmonics, and a sawtooth wave has odd and even harmonics. So sawtooth is actually the most harmonically rich of them all. So this is a sawtooth wave. And this is a square wave, or yeah, the pulse wave, basically a square wave. So I'll switch between those again. So the difference might be subtle, especially if you're kind of just starting out. But those basically, it gives you the ability to kind of really, like, from the very get-go, kind of choose what kind of timbral place you're going to be starting out with. So with an oscillator, obviously, the main thing you probably want to be able to do with it is change, play notes, change the pitch. So how do we do that? There is this frequency knob that allows us to change, tune it and change the pitch of our oscillator. So I can turn it up or pitch it up or down. I can also use the keyboard to, so the keyboard is sending pitch information to our oscillator, telling it what note to play. Okay, so out of our oscillator, we, remember, move into our filter. So the signal is going out of the oscillator directly into the filter. And a filter, there's different types of filters out there, low pass, high pass, band pass, notch filters, but the most common type that you'll probably find on a synthesizer is a low pass filter. A low pass filter is something that basically allows low frequencies to pass and cuts out high frequencies beyond a designated frequency threshold that you set. So kind of the big parameter that you'll see with a filter is what's called a cutoff center or cutoff frequency. There's this cutoff knob right here, and you can see that basically, I don't know if people are able to see this, but it basically can sweep between 20 hertz and 20,000 hertz. And for those that are familiar with that, those numbers, you would know that that's kind of our range of human hearing. So the pitch or sound that humans are able to perceive. Basically, when this is being used as a low pass filter, when I can basically use this knob to designate a frequency threshold, and so tell it everything above this point is going to get filtered out or subtracted from the original sound, and things below that frequency will be passed through. So just to hear that. So you should be able to hear that the sound, starts off really bright, but as soon as I start turning that, lowering the cutoff frequency, it's getting kind of darker and darker, and because we're removing kind of that high frequency content. The other very common and very fun parameter to play with in a filter is what's called resonance. In the case of filters, a resonance basically effectively, it just creates an emphasis around the cutoff, that cutoff frequency that you've set. So it basically kind of creates this bump in volume. It's wherever that cutoff frequency is. So if I raise the resonance, then you can kind of hear how that changes the sound when I sweep through the filter. So you can actually hear individual harmonics being brought out, because we're really we're really emphasizing exactly where the frequency, right where this cutoff is set. So if I go back up. So yeah, resonance is a very fun parameter to play with. Okay, keep moving forward. Next, out of our filter, we go into our amplifier, and in this case, the amplifier is basically, a volume control. Of course, you may have noticed that when I turn up this master volume, it's kind of just like the sound is just kind of constant and droning. So that is not going to be very useful to you unless, unless you're making drone music, which could be great, but often we want to be able to play discrete notes. So this is where our envelope generator comes in. So an envelope is something that you can think of as just basically creating a contour for a level change over time. So we're changing the level of something over time, and that in this case, how we're about to use it, we will be creating a volume change over time. So we're going to use our envelope to shape kind of the volume of our sound. So I'm going to kind of tell our amplifier to send our envelope generator to our amplifier now. And so if I turn this back up, we won't hear anything until I trigger our envelope. Envelopes are generally triggered they can be triggered by different things, but often they're just triggered as soon as you hit a key on a keyboard. Different envelopes on different synths will have kind of a different amount of what we call stages, but the one on the Mother 32 has, we have control over the attack stage and the decay stage. And the attack is basically the time it takes for that sound to get to its maximum level as soon as you hit a key. So when I press a key right now, the attack is very short, and so is the decay. So when I hit the key, the attack, because it's so short, the sound is just going to go to its maximum level right away. And then when I lift the key, which is what triggers the decay, the sound will cut out right away because it's a very fast decay. So if I raise the attack time, now when I press a key, it's going to take this longer amount of time to kind of fade in. Can make it a little more dramatic. And so with the decay, similarly, if I raise the decay time, I change the attack back to really fast. But now when I lift the key, it will take more time to fade out. So that is really an envelope in a nutshell. Basically, just think of it as a level change over time that can be applied to volume. It can be applied to other parameters as well, like pitch or the cutoff of our filter. And it's something that we can use basically to modulate other parameters. And remember, I mentioned kind of modulation is kind of at the heart, I think, of a synthesizer. So it's really all about making kind of these dynamic changes to the sound over time. And the last thing I want to point out is just the LFO, because that is a really key element. So LFO, again, is a low frequency oscillator. It's an oscillator that basically is optimized to generate very low frequencies. And generally, by low frequencies, I mean actually frequencies that are what we would call sub-audio rate. So audio rate basically kind of starts around 20 hertz, which is where we start to kind of perceive pitch and perceive sound. So LFOs generally put out frequencies below that. So ones that we wouldn't normally be able to hear, but instead we actually use those very low frequencies, those waveforms at low frequencies to control other elements of our synth. So the LFO on the Mother 32 has two different waveform types that it produces, a square wave and a triangle wave. And now I just kind of want to show how to do some really simple modulation, basically create a vibrato effect with the LFO, and hopefully that will just kind of, rather than me trying to like technically explain it, hopefully that will just demonstrate and make it obvious what the LFO is doing. So vibrato, again, is just, let me go back to just our drone. Vibrato is pretty much just a really fast varying of pitch, so I could kind of manually try to do that by kind of shaking this frequency knob back and forth. But that sounded pretty bad and was very imperfect. So thankfully, I have this LFO to kind of do that for me. So if I apply our triangle wave LFO to modulate the frequency of our oscillator, basically it's going to apply this triangle shape, which is kind of ramping up and down in this kind of linear way at a rate that I can set with this knob. It's going to apply that shape to control the pitch of our oscillator. So if I start to bring that in, this is what it sounds like. So you can hear now, basically, the LFO is, this triangle LFO is turning the pitch, moving the pitch up and down for me, essentially. And I can kind of use this modulation amount knob to kind of determine how wide I want it to sweep between pitches. So for vibrato, you'd probably just want kind of like, you know, not that much pitch variation. But you might, you know, it could be, you might have an effect where you want to really sweep between, really extremely between pitches. So that is pretty much using an LFO to create a vibrato effect. I also want to show how the square wave, just like different waveform shapes that you choose for your LFO, really affects the modulation. So with for a vibrato, I wanted to kind of use the triangle waveform, but if I wanted to create more of kind of a siren sound, it would be better to use the square wave output, because the square wave is essentially going back and forth between kind of an on and off state. So if I use a square wave to modulate our pitch, this is how it will sound. Let's go to a higher pitch. So now you can basically, as that square wave kind of goes between its on and off state, it's basically just sending that kind of information to control this frequency. So it's going kind of on off, but toggling between these two different pitches, and I can again widen that range by adding more, applying more of it. So that, yeah, again, is, you know, choosing the waveform that you want to use for the LFO. You know, they affect the sound. They'll affect the sound a little bit differently. I want to just quickly show before we. Oh man, we are quickly running out of time, but want to show using the LFO to create a tremolo effect really quickly, because this actually involves using this patch bay. So if I use, remember, tremolo is just basically modulating volume over time. So it's kind of turning the volume up and down really fast. So I could do that just by kind of wiggling that volume knob, but instead I could use our LFO to affect the volume for me. So the there's actually no switch on this or knob on the kind of normal controls of the Mother 32 that let me send the LFO to the amplifier, but that is where this comes in handy, because now I can find the output of my triangle wave from my LFO and send it into the input of my where my amplifier. So now if I do that and turn it up, basically now the triangle wave is kind of turning the volume up and down for me at whatever rate I've designated. So I can speed it up or slow it down. And if I turn it up really, really high, so this is actually going to start, now I'm going to push the LFO into audio rate actually. And instead of hearing kind of this up and down volume sound that we can kind of perceive, it actually is going so fast that it's just kind of creating a brand new timbre. And that's actually what amplitude modulation is just synthesis, is really just creating interesting new timbres by actually just modulating the volume very, very quickly at an audio rate. Okay, so I think this might be a good time to just pause and see if there's questions, and then we can kind of hopefully move into looking at a more detailed patch. And again, this is, you know, really this sound that we've already come up with. You know, it might not be that interesting, but you could consider this a patch. It's really, a patch is basically just, you know, refers to the sound that you have achieved through whatever settings you've, you know, set on your synthesizer. So it's where the knobs are turned, or, you know, if I had to connect some parts, you know, the patch basically is just whatever that resulting sound is and how I got there. And so you can really just think of a patch as a preset, if you're thinking kind of more in like, yeah, preset terms. But we have already pretty much created a patch. Like this in itself is actually a patch, but yeah, let's take some questions, and then we can kind of try to modify this a little bit to hopefully make it a little more interesting.
Yeah, for sure. So, Samantha, this is kind of jumping back a little bit, but Samantha was wondering what is a Eurorack, and if you could explain that.
Oh yeah, so Eurorack again is just a format. It refers to a specific format of modular synthesizer. So I was saying before, there's different formats, which basically refers to kind of like the size of the modules of the synthesizer modules. So actually this Moog Mother 32 was Moog's first Eurorack offering, which means this particular height is what we call 3 rack units high. Rack units are kind of a typical audio standard kind of measurement. And so this is what you call 3U high, and that is specific to Eurorack, where other modular formats might be taller. It also means, with Eurorack format, you always are using this type of patch cable, which is basically a TS or mono 1/8 inch. I don't know if that's blurry, but an 1/8 inch little patch cable. So Eurorack always uses that kind of type of patch cable. It also refers to kind of like the voltage levels that are specific to that format. Other questions?
Yeah, we've got, let's see. We got, yeah, Christina wants to know, and this is like a pretty simple function. Can you show us how to make a sine wave?
Oh, so great question. So there's actually no sine wave that is inherent really in there's no choice of sine wave that we can choose from on the Mother 32 itself, but you actually can kind of, using the patch bay, kind of like do a little workaround hack to kind of create somewhat of a sine wave sound. I don't know, do we have time to quickly demo that? I can do it very quickly. Basically, this filter, so Moog is famous for its filters, essentially. People really love the sound of Moog filters, with good reason. But one kind of thing about Moog filters is that you can basically, with this resonance control, remember what resonance does is it really creates an emphasis around the cutoff frequency of our filter. So it's really going to start turning up the volume at wherever this cutoff knob is set to. So if I have it set to like 2 kilohertz, 2000 hertz, basically if I turn up the resonance really, really high, it's going to really like strongly emphasize just that frequency. And this is kind of a way to kind of mimic. You can actually use your filter as a sound source especially with the specific Moog filter, because when you turn up the resonance super high, it actually goes into what's called self-oscillation. Essentially, resonance is just feeding the output of the filter back into itself. And so when you have the resonance up really high, it goes into self-oscillation, and basically you can kind of get a sine wave-ish tone out of it that way. So if I go out of my filter, let's see, where is it? VCF, the output, and go into, there's an external audio input on the Mother 32, so I can bring in external sound sources if I want. And if I choose that as my sound source, then we can actually hear something close to a sine wave, because so now actually what we're listening to is the filter self-oscillating, and now when I turn this knob, you're getting something very similar to a sine wave, because we're really just like very specifically emphasizing the specific frequency that this cutoff is set to. And we could even play it with our keyboard if we send the keyboard output into the filter cutoff. So now our keyboard is going to determine where this knob is set to. So that's kind of a little workaround way to get a sine wave out of something. If you have a filter that can go into self-oscillation, then you can kind of get a sine wave out of it that way.
Awesome. That was a really great demo. We have a couple more questions, but I think we should move on for now, and then we can come back to them at the end.
Okay, yeah. And so I just want to kind of quickly just talk through kind of how we might want to make this sound more interesting. Oh, whoops. So I actually pre-programmed my Stranger Things ripoff sequence. I already programmed it in. So let's see. So we have a sequence playing of notes, and while the notes, the pitch of the notes are, we have a melody going, so that's kind of some movement, but there's not really any movement in the sound, the timbre itself. It's kind of just like the same timbre on each note. So, modulation, again, kind of the key to the power of synth, we can actually, it might be interesting to create some sort of movement to that sequence. So instead of just kind of like every note having kind of the same exact timbre, we can kind of have the timbre kind of shift over time. And so one thing that I will do is actually have our LFO dynamically kind of change our cutoff frequency of our filter. So the sound, while as it moves through the sequence, it's actually going to change in brightness. So let's see. I'm right now going to apply our triangle wave, a very slow triangle wave to the cutoff. So now you should hopefully hear the sound is getting brighter and then darker again. And this is really just using the triangle wave LFO to kind of shift that cutoff frequency over time for me. Let's see, time. Last thing I'll show, and sorry, this is really running out. We went out of time very quickly, but I will, after this, I can stick around for a little bit longer to answer more questions. But we didn't really look at this setting. So first of all, I can change the waveform that we're using to kind of, choose which one I like better. I think I'm going to go with the pulse wave. And with pulse waves, I didn't talk about this knob. It's called pulse width. Pulse width is basically, so you can basically allows you to alter the harmonics that are present in your pulse wave. So as you move the pulse width, which is changing something called the duty cycle of the pulse wave, that basically, essentially when you change that, it will bring out different harmonics. So just to quickly hear that. So as I alter the pulse width, we're changing the harmonic makeup of the waveform. And so this is something that we could also change over time. So I'm just going to show how to actually, since we haven't used the envelope to modulate anything other than volume, I'm going to just show how to modulate the envelope modulate the pulse width with the envelope. So right now, here, I'm going to remove the LFO modulation of the filter for a second, but so I can, again, change pulse width over time, but I could also tell my envelope to basically change that for me. So if I have the envelope now modulating our pulse width, I can, every time I hit a key, it's actually going to kind of go like that, basically. It's going to change the pulse width over time throughout the duration of my note. So that's with the pulse width, envelope modulating pulse width, and this is without. Here, I'll turn up the cutoff again. So that is another way, basically, just within a single note, you can use an envelope generator to kind of like, just modulate that note kind of for its duration. So just to go back, let's see, to our sequence. So, we've got a little bit of variation in there now, a little bit of movement. Unfortunately, I think I'm going to have to kind of stop right there because I realize we're pretty much almost at time. But this is really just the tip of the iceberg. There's so many things that you can do, so many possibilities, and hopefully this just gave people a sense of, what you can do with a synthesizer. So I think maybe
Thank you so much, Adria. I'm going to jump in really quickly. This is Christina again. I want to thank everyone for being here. And if you can give some love to Adria in the chat box, that would be wonderful. Fantastic job. So much information and so many great questions. I want to let everybody know that we are going to stay on for a few more minutes afterwards. So if you have time and you want to stay on with us, please do. We can do another patch and answer some additional questions. But if you have to leave right now, I would love if you could take just a few minutes to help us out by giving us your feedback. I'm going to share a slide that has some links, wam.rocks/feedback. It takes about 2 minutes. If you can let us know what you thought of the session and what you want to see next, that will really, really help us out. We have upcoming sessions at wam.rocks/everywhere. You can see what live sessions are coming up next week. On Wednesday, we have an incredible session with Linda Perry, who's an award-winning Grammy-nominated songwriter, and she's going to give us some tips on how to craft a successful song. You can also see our on-demand trainings that are available. We have hundreds of hours of sound channel trainings, so you can keep learning while you're at home. And finally, if you are able to help us out by donating, we'll always appreciate that. These classes are free. We want to make sure everyone's out there learning and staying connected. But if you're in a position to, we love to have your donations. I'm going to go back to Adria to answer some more questions. Again, we're able to stay on for about 10 more minutes to get any other questions that we didn't answer. But please help us out by doing the feedback in the meantime, and we hope to see you at another session.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I guess, are there other questions? I don't know, Leila, if you had any. I'm just trying to actually now scroll through some of the.
Yeah, I got a couple jotted down. So Badisha was asking how is this what you're doing subtractive and not additive synthesis? So I guess what's the difference between those?
Yeah, so additive synthesis, generally, you start with a bunch. It's essentially the opposite of subtractive synthesis in a way. You can kind of think of it where with subtractive, again, you're starting with a harmonically rich sound source, something that has a lot of harmonics, and then using a filter to subtract harmonics from that, or frequencies. And then with additive synthesis, you're actually kind of creating an interesting timbre by building it up with sine waves. So sine waves, again, are just like a single frequency, just one frequency, and you can actually kind of recreate almost pretty much any sound. And there's actually some interesting software out there that allows you to kind of re-synthesize real-world sounds with using just sine waves. So if you know the, basically, it's essentially adding a bunch of sine waves together at different amplitudes to kind of create an interesting timbre. That's my short answer. And
Awesome.
I can elaborate more if need be.
No, I think that was an excellent explanation. Badisha, I hope that was helpful for you. She says thank you so much. So
You're welcome.
And so another question, Christina is asking, can your synth, which is the Moog Mother 32, is that a monophonic synth? And it's also a two-part question, so that was the first part. And the second part was, how do you save your work?
Oh, excellent question. So, so the first question was, is the Moog Mother 32 monophonic?
Yes.
Yes, it is. It's a monosynth. So there are actually some kind of like using the patch bay, there's kind of some kind of little hacks to kind of get two voices out of it. But technically it's a monosynth, which really means it kind of just has like a single kind of oscillator sound source. And saving the work. And so one great, really important thing to know about, especially if you're interested in modular synths, this is kind of the difficult thing about them, but also the beauty of them, I would say, is that your patches are pretty much ephemeral. There's no, the Mother 32 is an analog synth, so there's no like little computer chip inside that kind of can easily save information. So, there's no saving of the knob setting. So actually the Mother 32, maybe I can pick it up. If you get one, often, and a lot of, it's really nice when synth manufacturers do this, but they give you, they give you a little kind of diagram like the one that I put up. And it is really just kind of like a blank template so you basically can in terms of saving, you literally just kind of draw where you have the knob settings, where the switch was set. But with modular synths, yeah, generally, and fully analog modular synths, you can't really save presets. They're kind of gone after you unpatch them.
Awesome, great. Thanks for that question. And so Willow's asking, do you have synth recommendations for beginners?
Yeah, so that is like really kind of depends on what type of sounds you want to make. Again, um, you know, I was mentioning kind of different synths and different sound synthesis types kind of are good for different types of sounds. So it kind of depends. And again, like if you want to just to be playing like mostly making synth bass lines with a mono synth or kind of more synth pad kind of sounds with a polysynth. Um, so let's see. I mean, so if you're interested in, especially in getting into modular synths, the Mother 32, I would say, is a great entry kind of synth to use because you can eventually expand it out if you want to get into kind of modular synths. You can easily, and I think I saw a question in here about this, about you can actually remove the Mother 32 from its case and mount it in a Eurorack kind of a Eurorack case to live with other Eurorack modules. So it's a great synth if you want to kind of start getting into modular synths, but then because it has a normal signal path, you don't have to really do much patching in order to get sound out of it. So I definitely, recommend the Mother 32. I don't know if you're looking specifically for hardware or software. If you're still here, maybe feel free to chime in and kind of if you want to clarify.
She says mostly looking for hardware.
Hardware. Okay, so yeah, I would. And then, are you wanting something that can play multiple notes, or um, just like a single? Because yeah, oh,
Yeah, she's looking
polysynth.
for poly.
Oh my goodness, there are so many, just so many options out there. I mean, honestly, I think just starting with an all-in-one synth. Um, the ones that I'm thinking of right now, a lot of the kind of inexpensive hardware synths, I think most of the ones I'm thinking of off the top of my head are mono synths, but Korg has is it the Minilog, which is I think the monologue is their mono synth, and I think the Minilog, I don't know if someone wants to fact check this for me, the Minilog might be their polysynth. But I think I like that because it gives you, some synthesizers, and I'll say this with a lot of software synthesizers as well. They tend to, manufacturers tend to kind of want to be able to make a lot of wide range of sounds, which is great. But sometimes they're just like so feature heavy, feature rich that it gets a little bit confusing for beginners because there's just like so many parameters to look at. So I would say for a beginner, it might be good to start with a synth that really kind of has like a more like similar to the Mother 32, really has kind of all those kind of components and their kind of access to the filter, access to kind of like the waveform type things that you can kind of control without getting lost in the weeds of like all these different, so many different parameters to look at. So I think the Minilog, and someone is saying the Mini Moog is free from their page now. So yeah, there's a app. Oh, actually, if you want to try out if you have, I think this is just for iOS, for iPhone, but Moog had released their basically an app version of the Mini Moog for free during this kind of shelter-in-place time. So that definitely would be worth downloading if you have an iPhone or an iPad.
Great, and we have a quick yes or no question before our final one, which is, can you connect the Mother 32 to a DAW?
So yes, so basically, so the Mother 32 actually has a MIDI input. It has like the typical, like the old school DIN kind of connector, MIDI 5-pin connector input that you can basically, if you have a MIDI interface or some sort of audio interface that has a MIDI output, you can send, like for example, I often will be using Ableton Live and then send MIDI information, just MIDI notes out of Ableton Live and send them to the Mother 32, and then I bring that sound back into my audio interface just as audio. It's kind of basically using kind of like external instrument device. So you can send the Mother 32 MIDI information, but that's kind of the most of the integration I think you can really do. There's other modules in like the Eurorack realm that you can, I believe, yeah, kind of have kind of talking nicely more talk more nice with your DAW. So, and then there's also a bunch of tools out there for kind of getting like using your DAW to kind of trigger events in your synthesizer as well.
Great. And last question, and I think it's also a great sort of way to go out is doing a demo. But Brindle said they would love to see the basics of making a pad, which I know is kind of hard to do monophonically, but you can like talk about the sort of how
Yeah.
it would go
So I definitely, unfortunately, cannot demonstrate that on the Mother 32 as it's a monosynth, but for a pad, generally, I mean, if you kind of think about the general character, I mean, there's so many different synth pads out there, but definitely, like if you're trying to create one from scratch, one thing is definitely usually that you have a given is usually that there's probably like a long attack time and maybe like a long decay because synth pads are kind of these more textural elements that kind of live in the background, maybe not necessarily meant for the foreground. So definitely having something kind of like fade in slowly and fade out slowly by giving it, yeah, your envelope a long attack and decay time would be, definitely one thing. But yeah, unfortunately, I can't demo it right now on the Mother 32.